Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast. Today we're talking about how to study effectively and the 6 pillars of student success. For some time now, I've been wanting to do a bit of a signature episode, that one episode I can point any new listener to and say, listen to episode 66 and the 6 pillars of student success. It will cover everything you really need to know from the beginning. So today is that episode. Some of the ideas we'll meet today may be familiar if you're a regular listener. Things like retrieval practice and spaced learning, which we talked about in episodes 3, 7, 45, 46, how to find full focus, episode 29, 58, 60, and even some good ideas on good routine and getting the balance, the work-life balance right, episodes 30, 53, 67, for example. But what I've never done until today is bring it all together into a coherent system, all in one place. So today, I offer you that step-by-step guide from the beginning to getting the absolute essentials of your study strategy right. I make the assumption that learning knowledge of some kind is a substantial component of your course, as frankly it is for the majority of students one way or another. But if that really isn't true, you don't need to learn or remember anything for your course, I don't know, perhaps you're a creative writing major or something, then I hope you'll still benefit from some of the ideas in today's episode, which are relevant to all kinds of studying. And then when we do come on to talk about memorization a little later in the show, I hope that you might find it interesting and maybe helpful to you one day to know how to learn and remember more effectively, living as we do in the age of information, where knowledge is power. Now, as I was putting this together, I quickly realised that a single episode on how to study effectively was going to be woefully inadequate to talk about everything I wanted to talk about. So this actually turned into an 8-part series, effectively a full-blown audio course to turn you into an exam study expert. So lots to look forward to over the weeks to come. Today, I'm going to be setting the scene and introducing you to my 6 pillars of student success, the foundational principles that I'm going to be referring back to time and time again throughout the rest of this 8-part course. If you only listen to one episode from the whole series, I'd suggest making it this one. But I do hope you will stick with the rest of the series because in parts 2 through 7 of the series, we'll be focusing on applying the principles from today's episode to talk about specific study strategies, going far deeper than we ever have on the podcast before, right into the nuts and bolts, like the recipes, if you like, for a really great study technique. I'll be breaking down the exact steps you need to follow in your studying if you want to learn faster and remember more, with incredibly practical sets of do's and don'ts to give you the biggest results from each of the techniques we talk about in the shortest time. This sort of advice, by the way, is very typical of the sort of work I might end up doing with you if you join me as one of my exam success coaching clients. And from long experience of having done that, often it's just a few small adjustments to how you use a given technique that can have a really massive impact on how well that technique works for you and ultimately your performance in the exam. So I'll just wrap up this introduction with a quick taste of what's coming up in the rest of this course. So part 2 of the How to Study Effectively series will talk about the blank page retrieval technique, or brain dumps, and memory journaling. Part 3 will cover my personal favourite study strategy, which is flashcards. Part 4 is for anyone who likes making notes or summary notes. I'll teach you a relatively simple upgrade to your note making to a far better, far more effective alternative. Part 5 is on practice papers with some advanced tips for how you can use practice questions and practice exam papers in some quite creative ways, as well as the more fundamental ways, to achieve all sorts of benefits for your exam prep. In the 6th part, we're going to talk about how you can use mnemonics and the chunking principle to really hack your memory and kind of code up even the most complicated bits of knowledge in your course. In other words, a little tool set you can bring to bear on whichever bits of the course that you just struggle to get to stick the most. Part 7 is going to introduce a neat strategy you can use if you've got a lot of kind of math-style problems to practice. And finally, Part 8 is going to bookend the whole series, tying a bow on everything we've covered in the first 7 parts. But we start here in Part 1. And today I will be talking about 6 principles that together make up, the fundamentals of how to study effectively. The 6 pillars are: number 1, know where you're going. Number 2, know you can get there. Number 3, make time for the journey. Number 4, eyes on the road when driving. Unfortunately, the whole kind of journey driving theme broke down a bit when I got to pillars 5 and 6, but they're super, super important. They are number 5, learn faster by retrieving, and number 6, remember for longer by spacing. So without further ado, let's get right into the first pillar, and a very, very warm welcome to this first part of the Exam Study Expert How to Study Effectively course. So, pillar number 1, know where you're going. First things first, what do you actually need to do to succeed in your course? If you're studying for exams, the first thing you need to be clear on is what's expected of you. So have a list of topics and subtopics and consider devising a simple tracking system so you can see at a glance which topics need more work. A traffic light system can work great for this. Just list out your topics, then code up with a red dot for needs work, an amber dot for kind of getting there, and green for I got this. So then you simply start with your red topics, and then when you're done with those, move on to the amber ones. What if you're not working for exams? What if you've got a big assignment? Well, I'd say the same sort of thing. Start by thrashing out what the big building blocks of the task are. So this could be by content area. What are the different topics you need to work on as part of your overall assignment? Or it could be thinking about the different phases of the work. So I need to do some new reading and then some planning, then the writing up, and then the proofreading, or the editing and then the proofreading. Either way, once you've kind of got this map, do a very rough time budget for it. So if there are 11 chapters that you need to study and you've got 25 days before the test, that's roughly a chapter every couple of days, with a couple of days left over in hand at the end. Does that time budget feel remotely realistic? If not, how can you reprioritize or perhaps scale back your ambitions to make the task fit into the time available? I really wouldn't suggest being any more detailed in your study plan than that. You'll hear the student story from Charlie in a few weeks' time, and he makes the point really nicely that, planning hour by hour what topic you'll work on is often just a straitjacket that neither works nor really helps. In planning, you're looking for a bird's eye view of the road ahead, not a minute-by-minute timetable for every single moment. I would also advise looking at the destination. So, as a good example, if you're learning for tests and exams, most students spend time learning a topic first, and then they might start to look at past paper questions. What I would say is flip that on its head, and you might find you can get results more easily. So start your study process by looking at real exam questions for that topic, maybe even attempting a few, making those educated guesses where you need to. Then, when you go back and revise the topic, you'll have a much deeper sense of what you need to know and why, because you'll know exactly how you'll end up applying it in the exam. All of this just kind of helps the topic go in much better. It's a bit like a farmer ploughing his field before sowing the crops. By kind of exposing yourself to those exam questions and kind of understanding, how am I going to use this knowledge? It sort of somehow ploughs the fields of your memory and helps the knowledge soak in when you come then to studying from your books. What would the equivalent of this be if you're working on a project or assignment? Well, this whole idea about looking ahead to the destination might mean something like looking at how the assignment is marked, if you can, and possibly seeking out any examples of what a really good assignment looks like. Perhaps some past student projects are available in the library, or your tutors might have made some model essays available. Either way, the more you can understand about what your assessors want to see, the easier will it be for you to deliver it for them. So that was the first pillar, know where you're going. The second one is know you can get there. Some study advisors recommend setting goals about what you want to achieve in your exams. That's absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with a sensible goal, but I want you to go a level deeper, and I want you to decide what kind of student do you really want to be? Are you going to decide to identify as a high-performing student or not? Once you do decide you're going to be a high performer, you start to magically behave accordingly. So that might only mean a small tweak to your habits each day, maybe working 2.25 hours instead of 2, just going that slight extra mile, or perhaps using retrieval practice, not just rereading. These small little changes, sustained each day over weeks and months, can add up to a massive difference in the end result at the end of the year. What if you struggle to associate with that new identity as a high performer today? Well, then I'd say start by pretending. Ask yourself, what would a high performer do when faced with this situation? How would they tackle this assignment? How would they respond to this tricky exam question? Then you act accordingly. With a bit of practice and a bit of time, you'll eventually turn around and realise that you can stop pretending to be a high performer. You are the high performer you've been pretending to be all this time. So there's a little bit like a version of fake it till you make it, which isn't a phrase I massively love, but it does sum up this idea quite well. Now, here's a really important point. Ability isn't fixed. Your brain can grow and change and develop, and with the right kind of practice, you can get better at things even if you weren't so good at them before. Okay, so you don't believe you have what it takes to be a high performer. You're not smart enough, not clever enough, whatever. I'm here to tell you that you don't have to settle with where you're performing today. With deliberate, sustained practice, you can level up your brain and improve your abilities in things. There's really no such thing as being not good at something. You're just not good at it yet. So this idea that your abilities can level up and improve is something called growth mindset. Studies tell us that the more you adopt this belief, the more you adopt this growth mindset, the belief that you can grow and change and improve with the right kind of practice, the more you're likely to excel in life, including at school and in college. Now, this is all kind of quite interesting, but the thing that absolutely fascinates me about the idea of growth mindsets is the fact that, this whole concept that your brain can grow and change and you can improve at stuff, it's not just a metaphor, it's not just a nice fuzzy mindset thing. It is literally true that you can improve the very wiring of your brain with the right kind of practice. Here's an example from the psychology literature on this. So I don't know if anyone's visited London back in the days where the London black taxi cabs would drive you around, or whether there's something similar in a city near you. But London is a ferociously complicated city when it comes to navigating its roads. And you can, certainly in the days before, all the taxi drivers drove around with Google Maps, as many do today, you could hop into a black London taxi cab, and ask the driver to take you anywhere in the city, and he or she would know how to get there, even if it was right on the other side of town, like an hour and a half away, navigating perhaps hundreds of roads along the way. An immense amount of geographical knowledge in the heads of these drivers. Now, were the drivers born with this knowledge? Of course not. They studied for it. To become a London black taxi cab driver, you have to take an exam called the knowledge. And psychologists did a really interesting experiment where they scanned the brains of London taxi drivers before and after studying for the knowledge. And what they found, just totally fascinating, the little bit of the brain that kind of deals with map knowledge and navigation had actually grown measurably and developed its structure in the drivers before they'd done their studying for the knowledge versus after. So they had literally changed and rewired and improved their brain through studying, through the right kind of practice. We've seen this in the animal kingdom as well. If we look at squirrels that hide away nuts, thousands of nuts all across the forest in little caches in the autumn or the fall to get ready for winter, as a food store to see them through the winter. So they got to remember these thousands of nut locations all across the forest. You actually see that the hippocampus, which is heavily involved in memory, of a squirrel, hippocampus is a brain structure that's heavily involved in memory. A squirrel's hippocampus will be bigger in the autumn or fall as it's heading into winter, and it needs to remember all the locations of those nuts. And then if you scan it again in the spring after winter, it will be shrinking again. So, the brain literally can mold itself to the challenges you are asking of it. And finally, on growth mindset, if all I've said so far hasn't been enough to convince you, then I want you to think about paying attention to the stories of students like you who might have struggled, maybe even had failure and disappointment at first, only they kept practicing, they kept persevering, maybe they changed something about their mindset or their study strategy, and ultimately they had success. Such stories can be incredibly powerful for changing what we believe is possible for ourselves. When we hear someone else who's gone through that story, that journey from struggling to success, we think maybe I can do that too. So next week on the podcast, I have one such story for you. You'll meet Katie, and hers is a wonderful journey of how she essentially fell off the rails as a student, had to leave her university course. Quite a painful, quite a tough time for her, only to take some time away, develop as a person, and return with renewed vigour, renewed work ethic, renewed mindset on a different course to earn a really wonderful degree, a first-class degree from university at the end of it. It's an inspirational tale, and there are so many lessons to be learned. So I do hope you'll be able to join me for next week's episode, where there's a really great practical example of all we've just been talking about knowing you can get there, even if things feel a little hard along the journey. So that was pillar number 2. Let's dive right on to number 3. It's time to make time for the journey. Behind just about every successful student is a great study routine. Your study routine is quite a personal thing, so I can't give you a one-size-fits-all template timetable that just works for everybody. But if you don't have a regular routine, it's well worth doing the exercise just to take a few minutes. It doesn't take very long, but just taking a few minutes to sketch out what your ideal day might look like. By sketching that clear intention out, you're much more likely to be able to stick to it tomorrow and the days to come. So here are some points to consider when you are planning your routine. When are your energy levels highest? Do you work better in the first half of the morning, just before lunch, late afternoon? Schedule your study blocks accordingly to take advantage of this biological prime time, as New York Times best-selling author and past exam study expert guest Chris Bailey calls it. You might also want to think about adding in some regular spaced retrieval practice, right into your study routine itself. For example, you might want to test yourself on new material from the day, first thing in the morning and last thing at the night. Stay tuned for more on spacing in pillar number 6 in a few moments' time. Another thing for your study routine is to consider is leaving time for you. So I see this a lot. If you're ambitious, as I know many of you are, it's tempting to cram as much work into each day as possible, potentially skimping on sleep. Resist this temptation. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. Take the time to rest, eat well, exercise, and sleep properly at night, and you will be able to give much more of yourself for longer. So ultimately, you get more work done over the long run, not less. It's a counterintuitive idea, and it can be quite a difficult adjustment first. But honestly, taking the time to get that work-life balance right is absolutely in your long-term interests. And finally, think about starting sure. So if you're new to your study routine, perhaps don't aim to smash it out of the park with an absolutely killer day on day one. I'd much rather see you set your sights relatively conservatively with a routine you absolutely know you can stick to, even on days when your energy or motivation is at its lowest. If you turn up on the day and feel like you're able to do a bit more, then do a bit more. But far better to set yourself up to success and end up exceeding your expectations than setting yourself up for a real stretch and ending up, not achieving what you set out to do and getting discouraged and demotivated. I've got quite a lot more to say on the subject of study routine. If you want to look that up, you can Google the words study routine and you can read my full article on extreme study routine secrets for ambitious students. As I say, just Google study routine and that should pop up for you on the first page of Google. Now, once you've got your study routine set out, you want to aim for consistency. So that may mean tweaking your routines so you can be consistent. Again, just to emphasize, I'd much rather you had a routine that you can absolutely definitely achieve every single day, rather than one that you might struggle to achieve. Maybe you get it for a day or two, and then you start to fail and get a bit discouraged. The key to studying effectively, and pretty well everything else in life, is consistency. And the difference between high performers and everyone else is often really small. To go back to what I was saying earlier, let's just take a more specific example. So 2 students want to get into Cambridge. One spends a quarter of an hour a night reading around her subject, the other doesn't. 6 months later, one has lots of interesting things to say in her interview, the other doesn't. The daily routines of both students were almost identical, bar for that 15 minutes reading around the subject. Or to take another example, 2 people want to get a book written. One puts in half an hour, maybe even just 10 minutes every single morning to write a page. The other one doesn't. A year later, one has 365 pages and a whole book written, and the other doesn't. Again, really similar daily routine, bar for this just tiny bit of daily habit, tiny bit of consistency. You're probably getting my point by now, but just one final example. 2 students are ambitious for exam success. One spends 10 minutes a night memory journaling, the other doesn't. Come the end of the year, one has a fabulous memory of all the key knowledge for the course and goes on to do really well in the exams. And I'll be talking much more about memory journaling in part 2 of this series in a couple of weeks' time. So, stay consistent with your routine and know that sometimes just quite small changes to your daily habits, you can change your life if you stay consistent for long enough. So that is making time for the journey. We move on now to talk about pillar number 4, which is to keep your eyes on the road when you're driving. Okay, listen closely. Do you want to know my secret to full focus? It's doing one thing at a time. So look, that might sound a little bit cheesy, and it is, but it's so true, and there's so much truth in that. Let me just unpack the idea for you a little bit. So it's really tempting to think you can get more done by multitasking, but actually each time your concentration breaks or you switch to thinking about something else, even just for a few seconds, you end up potentially losing valuable minutes refocusing on whatever it was you were trying to do. The brain is not good at task switching. Every time you flip your attention from one thing to another, you lose a little bit of time, you lose a little bit of momentum as you try and refine your focus on whatever the original task was. So we've got a whole battery of scientific evidence now that shows us how a brain that's trying to multitask is frankly just a less healthy brain. So if you look through the research, when you multitask, psychologists tell us that there's a measurable impact on IQ. Your IQ goes down if you're trying to multitask. Your attention span is shorter. That kind of stands to reason. Your productivity is lower. You can't get as much done. Your memory is worse. You struggle to remember things. Your stress levels go up. Even your happiness has been shown to go down. So people that multitask more tend to be less happier. And that could well be because happiness is strongly associated with making progress towards our goals. And multitasking does make it harder to make progress towards our important long-term goals. So look, all of these things are not a set of disadvantages anyone wants while studying. So, multitasking, definitely not a good mix when you're studying. So what should we do instead? There is a smarter way. the smarter way is focusing on one thing at a time, as I mentioned. I call this idea monotasking. So rather than being multitasking and being all distracted, practice monotasking, mono meaning one, doing one thing at once, rather than multi, many, and being really disciplined about giving your full attention to the task at hand. How can you do this? How can you achieve this in practice? How can you achieve this, Zen-like focus on one thing at a time? It's actually a little bit harder to actually do in reality than it is for me to just say it as advice. So here are a few practical strategies that will help you to monotask in your studies. I'm going to be talking about two different kinds of distractions here, so external and internal, and there are different strategies you need to combat each one. So external distractions, those are anything in the world around you that can break your thoughts, even if just for a moment. So let's start by controlling these. First, set yourself up for success by choosing a study environment that has fewer distractions. Ideally, that's an environment in which you only study, so you don't do anything else in that environment, so that your brain learns to treat just simply being in that place, even that sitting in that specific chair, as a powerful cue that it's time to do some studying. Second, we need to get on top of distractions from technology. This is a big one for a lot of us. So start by taking control of your phone. Put it on airplane mode, or better yet, switch it off. Then get it off your desk and out of sight. Even just having it in sight, but off, so you don't get any tings or buzzes or notifications, you might still find that glancing the smartphone out of the corner of your eye just triggers little thought loops about, what's been going on social that day, or, a message you've sent out to someone, you're wondering what they'll reply. So, far better even than just turning it off, like putting it actually out of sight and therefore out of mind. So that's the smartphone. What about if you're working on a laptop? Well, I'd say put it on airplane mode if you can, so that you're less tempted by the great playground of the internet. Or if you really do need the internet to work, then consider changing the passwords on all of your biggest sources of distraction. So, Netflix, social media accounts, whatever, and then put those passwords on a piece of paper as far away from yourself as possible. So ideally, that password list would live in a completely different room. If you share accommodation with others, choose a public room like the kitchen, so that, the slight, perhaps perceived shame of walking past others to retrieve your passwords acts as a further deterrent to getting distracted. So we've got on top at least a little of those external distractions. Let's talk a bit about internal distractions now. So it's normal for other thoughts to drift into your head, for your mind to wander when you sit down to work. Worrying about other subjects, other assignments, ideas or plans for your social life, for holidays, things you need to do later tonight or at the weekend, maybe just things you're worrying about in your life. There's a couple of recommendations for you on internal distractions, the ones that come from within. The first is to train your mind to have better focus through meditation. We've talked about this on the show before, and there'll be a bit more coming on it next year, so I don't want to say too much about it for now. I refer you back to episode 31 for more on this powerful idea. A second idea to control internal distractions is maintaining what I call a distractions list. So keep a notepad to hand, piece of paper beside you while you're studying, so that you can write thoughts down, get them out of your head as soon as they occur. You can always come back to them later when you've got the time to give them the attention they need. So some of them might be to-do list items, order a pizza later, or go and buy more pens, or whatever. Just write those thoughts down, and then you can come back to them and review your distraction list later and work out what are the action items for you to do. Some of the things you've written down on your distractions list might just be things to worry about. So you can sort of almost give your brain permission later on, save it some time to do a little bit of worrying if that's what you need to do. Anyway, by writing it down, you give your brain permission to just let go of those thoughts in the moment, clear your mind, and get back to the task in hand. By the way, a very similar strategy can work wonders if you struggle to get to sleep because your brain is racing with all these thoughts. Just keep paper beside your bed, write those thoughts down as they come up, clear your mind, and it's much easier to drop off to sleep. Okay, so principle 4 then is keeping your eyes on that road, being very, very strict about focusing on one thing at once, not multitasking, but monotasking, and controlling those external and internal distractions, finding a good environment, controlling technology, controlling the distractions you get through technology, considering training your focus through meditation, and building that distractions list. We move on now into the fifth and penultimate strategy I've got for you today. We're getting now into the knowledge and memorization end of things, which is where I start to get really excited. So the last couple of pillars are maybe slightly longer than the first 4, but they are super, super important if there is any little shred of learning or memorizing you need to do on your course. So here we go with pillar number 5, learn faster by retrieving. So we've talked about retrieval practice on the podcast many times before, but I couldn't do an episode on how to study effectively without at least mentioning it. Because, really, honestly, if there's only one piece of advice you ever take away from anything I have ever said, it's to do retrieval practice well and constantly. So much of the rest of this series of episodes in the How to Study Effectively course, they're going to be based on retrieval practice. In particular, episodes 2 through 5 of the series are essentially going to be deep dives into specific techniques that are based on retrieval practice. Things like flashcards and Q&A notes, practice papers, memory journaling, brain dumps. All of those things rely on retrieval practice. I'm going to be talking to you in those later episodes about the kind of specific step-by-step recipes for using those techniques. But you can't get anywhere without just firstly understanding what retrieval practice is, why it works, and what it means for effective ways to study. So here is a reminder. So there are lots of different ways to study. I've just mentioned a few of them now. Any study strategy you could possibly come up with, I could categorize it for you into one of 2 camps. Categorize it into one of 2 categories. Either long way study techniques or smart way study techniques. So long way study techniques are those that, might work eventually to help you learn. Some of the knowledge might rub off, but it'll be a slow process and it's not particularly reliable once you get into an exam. You're much more likely to forget things when you actually need it most. Smart way techniques, on the other hand, get your results much faster. You can learn faster, remember more, and crucially remember for longer and more reliably. Now, what do long way techniques have in common? What do smart way techniques have in common? Well, long way techniques, the thing that characterizes those is there's some element of pushing knowledge into memory. So you're taking in information through your 5 senses, particularly sight if you're reading, or through your ears, through hearing if you're listening to information. The information is going in. You are taking in information from your environment. Now, we often need to start with kind of long way techniques. You need to take in the information in the first place. But the real trick, if you want to study effectively, is to move on as quickly as possible, probably before you feel truly comfortable, into smart way techniques. So what's going on in a smart way is, as you've probably seen, you probably might have guessed where I'm going, they are techniques that involve retrieval practice. In other words, some element of testing yourself, pulling knowledge out of memory, some element of reaching back into your memory, trying to remember the answer to a question. When you're doing that, that is retrieval practice. And if you're doing that in a revision technique, a study technique, then I'm very happy to call it a smart way technique that will give you bigger results in less study time. So let me just kind of do a bit of a categorization of a few common study techniques for you then. So long way techniques, perhaps the most fundamental way of studying is just reading or rereading your notes or your books. That is firmly a long way technique. So very hard to get information to stick just by reading it over and over again. A slight improvement on rereading is highlighting or underlining, just not highlighting whole paragraphs, but just highlighting like the 10, 20% of the text, the really key words. That is still a long way technique because there's no element of testing yourself or remembering what you know, no retrieval practice, in other words, but it is slightly better at least than just rereading. There's a very minor advantage just by well, if you know how your eyes read, if you know how your eyes work when you're reading, they move in these little jumps called saccades. So you're not actually focusing on every single word in turn. You sort of jump, maybe focus once every 6 words and take in the other words in peripheral vision. So when you're doing highlighting, that helps your eyes to slow down and not skip over any important information, as well as just making it easier if you come back to those notes again to see the key bits popping out at you. So 2 long way techniques then: rereading, highlighting or underlining. And now I want to talk about making notes next. So again, like rereading, making notes, just phenomenally popular. I see students doing this all the time. Unfortunately, it is still a long way technique. So it may be like active, you're doing something, you're writing, but you're not crucially pulling anything out of memory when you're making notes. Mind maps or spider diagrams, it's kind of like making notes, but like drawing visual representations, showing how the knowledge links together. That might be slightly better than making notes for some situations, because it helps you sort of see how the knowledge is structured and how different bits of the topic link into other bits. But again, no element of sort of testing yourself on what you know, no element of pulling things out of memory. So unfortunately, that does count as a long way technique as well. Now, again, just before I move on to the smart way techniques, like you might want to start out with long way techniques. If you've got plenty of time, particularly, maybe you can afford to spend a little bit of time on the long way techniques, just getting familiar with the material in the first place. But what you want to do for biggest results in less time is move on as quickly as possible into doing the retrieval practice, pulling stuff out of memory, testing yourself on what you know. In other words, moving into the smart way techniques as quickly as you possibly can, so that you spend the majority of your study time with the smart way strategies. So just to mention 3 examples, flashcards. I'm going to be talking about those in the 3rd part of this How to Study Effectively series. They're a fantastic way to test yourself. You look at a question on the front, try and remember the answer on the back. Brilliant, really simple, really effective bit of retrieval practice. Practice questions, so doing practice questions from your books or past exam papers. Again, assuming you're doing it closed book with your notes away, that's again a really effective way to do retrieval practice. I'm going to talk more about that in part 5 of this How to Study Effectively series. And finally, quiz apps. So they work in very similar way to flashcards. They're basically just digital flashcards. So things like Anki or Quizlet that I know many of you like, that's the same as flashcards. So when you tune in to hear my flashcard thoughts, you'll get some best practice tips for using quiz apps as well, because they're just 2 different formats for exactly the same thing. Just before I move on from this categorization, I did just want to circle back on making notes, because there is a way you can upgrade your note making to actually make it properly effective. I call it Q&A notes, and I'm going to be talking about that more in part 4 of this series. So do join me again for that if you like making notes. So that's a bit of a categorization for different techniques. The next thing I just wanted to briefly mention on retrieval practice was the fact that, I don't want you to just take my word for it. So we've got no kind of guest experts or psychologists here on the show today. It's just me. But I do just want to give you a quick experiment, a quick study from the academic literature to just really underline how powerful retrieval practice can be. So it was Rödinger and Karpicki, 2006. They took 2 groups of students, got one group to learn by rereading, one group to learn by retrieval practice. They brought both groups back a week later, gave them a test on what they'd just learned. The retrieval practice group outperformed the rereaders by 20 percentage points. So the rereaders got about 40%, the retrieval practice group got about 60%, like 40% versus 60%. Like that is just a massive, massive improvement in a test score. Both groups had exactly the same amount of study time, but just this massive impact from switching your study technique. That really is at the heart of the power of studying effectively, and the reason I get so excited about teaching this stuff. Just the size of those improvements that are possible. There's one final thing that's quite intriguing about the Rödinger and Karpicki study. They actually asked the students in the study to predict their test score. on the way out of that learning session on the first week. So they'd both done, I can't remember exactly, an hour or so maybe of studying using either rereading or retrieval practice. And the students were all asked on their way out of the experimenter's lab, we'll bring you back in a week's time for the test, just predict your score. What do you think you'll get? Now, the really interesting thing to me is that the rereaders were actually more confident on their test score than the retrieval practice group. The rereaders thought they would get a better score than the retrieval practice group on average. And I think that just goes to show that, sometimes our intuitions about what's working well for us are not always very accurate. So, if you're skeptical about the whole idea of retrieval practice, what I would say is just, take an upcoming test, try retrieval practice, properly try it, give it a really good go. And you might not feel the difference like on day one, but certainly by kind of a week later, if you're testing yourself on knowledge a week later, you should really start to feel the difference compared to how you normally study. Okay. One final myth one final kind of frequently asked question, I guess I want to clear up on retrieval practice before we move on, is just the kind of the concern that you have to get everything right when you're doing your retrieving. So, testing yourself on what you know, asking yourself questions in some way, trying to remember the answers. Do you have to be getting everything right? The answer is no, of course not. It's great if you remember accurately. Your memory of that information will get significantly stronger. That's the power of retrieval practice. That's great. But it actually doesn't matter if you remember inaccurately, get the answer wrong, or you just simply don't have a clue. Because in, there's latter two cases, you didn't know the answer or you didn't have a clue, that will highlight where you need to do more work, highlight where you need to prioritize your time, and also help you learn. Humans are evolutionarily hardwired to learn from things in the environment that we find surprising. So when we come across, mistakes, things that we got wrong or, just didn't know the answer to, the brain is more likely to pay attention. It's more likely to kind of, latch on to that bit of information and try and absorb it and remember it for next time, much more so than if you hadn't just tested yourself on it at all. So honestly, it really doesn't matter whether you get it right or wrong. It's all part of the process. It's all part of the exercise. It's all good practice. So pillar number 5, learn faster by retrieving. Don't just push information in over and over again by rereading, highlighting, or taking notes. It might feel as though you're learning. Remember that Ruding and Karpicki study, the people that were coming out of the study session most confidently were the ones that have been doing the rereading. So it might feel as though you're learning if you're rereading, but I promise you will quickly forget what you studied. So instead, focus on pulling information out of memory and testing yourself on what you know. So less time rereading, doing highlighting, making notes, more time with retrieval practice techniques like flashcards, quiz apps, the Q&A strategy I'll talk about in episode 4 of this series, and practice papers. So we have one final pillar coming up. It is number 6, remember for longer by spacing. So we have one final pillar coming up. It is number 6, remember for longer by spacing. So retrieval practice is awesome and will solve all our problems, right? Not quite. It's phenomenally effective, but you do need to combine it with one other principle if you really want to get the most out of it. That's because no matter how well you learn something on day 1, we'll forget it over time. It's called the forgetting curve. As the weeks and days go by, we can remember less and less of whatever it was we knew on day 1. It's kind of hard to talk about curves and graphs in a podcast. But if you want to go to examstudyexpert.com/free tips, you can download my cheat sheet, which summarizes many of the most important ideas from this episode. And it includes a nice illustration of the forgetting curve, as well as much more. Again, that's examstudyexpert.com/free tips. Now, the only way to beat the forgetting curve is spaced learning. That means revisiting the topic at time intervals on different days. Some people call it spaced repetition. To psychologists, it's spaced learning. I'm a psychologist, so I call it spaced learning. It's the same idea as spaced repetition. Now, like retrieval practice, spaced learning is incredibly powerful stuff. So to make sure you don't have to take my word for this one, let's hear again from spaced learning expert Dr. Carolina Cooper-Tetzel from the University of Glasgow.
So we know from massive body of research that spaced practice works with different kinds of material, with different learners, so young learners, more mature learners. We know that it works for different types of skills that you want to acquire. It works for acquiring knowledge, remembering facts, but it also works for motor skills. We have those different experimental studies that were conducted over the past years and showing really that it accumulated this evidence that spaced practice is a strategy that works for many different domains and for many different learners.
The principle of spacing is simple. It's not about spending more hours on a topic necessarily. It's just about spreading that time out. And that's what gives rise to that, really powerful effect that Dr. Carolina Cooper-Tetzel was describing. It's been shown many, many times in the academic literature, just like retrieval practice. So what you want to think about, here's an example. So rather than spending an hour all in one go to do your exam study on a given topic, take that hour that you would have done anyway and split it up. So do half an hour to start with, maybe 10 minutes later in the day, 10 minutes the following day, 10 minutes after a week or so. You've still done an hour in total, but you've spread it out. You've spaced it out over time. That's what spaced learning is all about. Now, really key point. When it comes to actually doing the spacing, what you really want to be doing is spaced retrieval practice. Not just any old, looking at a topic when you come back and do your spaced revisit of that topic. Don't just come back and reread it the next day. When you come back to it the following day or a week later or whenever, you want to test yourself on it. And that means testing yourself on it from cold. Don't just have a little browse through that topic before you do the testing to refresh your memory. That kills the whole point of spaced retrieval practice. It should feel a bit hard when you do your spaced retrieval practice. I've got a little demonstration that I like to use that gives you the exact feeling of what I mean when I say should feel a bit hard when you're doing your spaced retrieval practice. So try and answer the following 3 questions. I'll give you a little pause after each one to give you a chance to think. I'll start with an easy question. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Got your answer? Wasn't too hard, hopefully. All right, this next one might test you a bit. What did you have for dinner on this date 1 month ago? So I say it's the 15th of September. What did you have for dinner on the 15th of August? Bit tricky, that one, huh? Okay, here's one final question. What did you have for lunch 2 days ago? So lunch 2 days ago. Go on, you might be able to get this one. Give it a little bit of thought for a couple of seconds. Now, for most people, the breakfast today question is too easy. It's still really fresh in memory. You barely have to think about it at all. So if you're doing your spaced retrieval practice and it all feels that easy, you're getting all the questions right without hesitation, probably is a sign that you might want to think about spacing out more, leaving a longer time gap before you come back to things the next time. On the other hand, if you're not getting any questions right, or it feels totally impossible to remember, like that, what did you have for dinner 1 month ago? You've probably left it too long. So not to worry, that's okay. You can go back and do some long way techniques at that point, go back and reread it or whatever, do highlighting, but just reduce the time lag for spacing next time. What you're aiming for is getting most, perhaps not all, but most questions right, perhaps with a little bit of hesitation and thinking time as you reach back into your memory, like most people feel when they do, that lunch 2 days ago example. Most people I do that with can get the right answer, can remember what they had for lunch 2 days ago, but it takes them a few moments to figure it out. So that is what you're aiming for the spacing, the best spaced learning. Like you're getting most questions right with a little bit of thinking time, a little bit of screwing up your eyes and trying to reach back into your memory and remember the right answer. So I call this whole principle of how to use spacing really well, I call it the Goldilocks effect. After Goldilocks and the Three Bears, porridge doesn't want to feel too hot or too cold. It wants to be just right, or not too salty or not too sugary. It's just right. So similarly, your spaced retrieval practice doesn't want to feel too easy, but it doesn't want to feel impossible either. You want to aim for somewhere in the middle, that just right zone in the middle, where it's challenging but not impossible. If it's too difficult to remember, space less next time, leave a shorter time gap. If it's too easy and all the answers you get 100% right, no hesitation, then leave a longer time lag. It's related to the idea of, this is the idea of desirable difficulties that Dr. Veronica Yan was talking to us about in the podcast earlier in the year. So a final top tip for spacing, perhaps the most important tip for spacing of all. Experience tells me that this can actually be a pretty difficult principle to put into action. It's a simple idea, spread it out over time, come back to it on different days. But in reality, once you start to do that, all those different topics, tracking the spacing you need to do for each, when you first did it, when you did it for the second time, when you need to come back to it for the third time. Frankly, it can turn into a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare, keeping tabs and scheduling in all those spaced repetitions. Now, I don't like complicated because it means it's very unlikely to actually happen. I like simple because it means you're far more likely to actually be able to do it. And of all the things we talk about, I want you to be able to do them. That's the whole point. I want to make your life easier and more successful in your studies. So to make spaced learning simple, so you can actually do it, my top recommendation is coming up with a strategy to build spacing right into your study routine itself. So when you're thinking about pillar number 3, making time for the journey, as you're designing your study routine, I mentioned at the time thinking about building in some time for spaced repetitions right into your study routine. Here's an example of what it would look like. This is how I was building spaced repetition right into my study routine as a psychology student. So I was working for about 50, 55 minutes at a time. Rather than doing 50, 55 minutes of new stuff, I'd take 5 minutes at the end of each session. I was mainly making flashcards as a university student. That just happened to be my personal preference. So I'd take 5 minutes at the end of that 55-minute session, and I would just recap all the flashcards I'd just done. So flashcards I've made in the last 50 minutes, I'd test myself on them for the first time. Then I'd go away, have a short break, grab a cup of tea or refill my water bottle. I'd come back a few minutes later and I would do exactly the same thing again. I would test myself on those flashcards a second time. And I was aiming to get the ones that I'd got wrong a minute ago. I was then aiming to get as many of those right as I could the second time around as possible. So within 10 minutes, I'd already tested myself on all the new flashcards twice. The end of the day, I think I mentioned this back in Pillar 4 when I was talking about, building your study routine, maybe the last slot of the day. So save, half an hour or an hour at the end of the day. Don't do anything new in that time. So no new flashcards. Just use that to recap on all the new materials from that day. So again, my case, I was making flashcards. My final, I can't remember what it was exactly, maybe half an hour, 40 minutes at the end of the day, I would test myself on all the new flashcards from that day for what was then a third time. Go to bed, wake up the next morning. The first slot of the next day would be, again, retrieval practice from yesterday. So by the time we were 24 hours in, I'd tested myself on new flashcards 4 times. 5 minutes at the end of the session, 5 minutes at the start of the next session, half an hour at the end of the day, half an hour the following morning. Now, that's quite a hardcore spacing schedule. That's a lot of repetitions within the first 24 hours. I found I needed to do that because the information I was learning was pretty darn hard. It was complex. There was a lot of it. I found any less than that, and it just wasn't sticking. If you're working on something a little bit easier, or you find it sort of sticks a bit more straightforwardly, maybe you don't need to do all those repetitions. Again, what I'm talking about here is just an example. It's an illustration, not a kind of template to follow. So, use the Goldilocks principle. So when you're doing your spaced repetitions, it wants to be a bit hard, but not impossible, not too easy. Use that principle to kind of come up with your own way to build spacing right into your study routine. So that wraps up pillar number 6, the 6th and final pillar. So space out your retrieval practice, keep testing yourself, and it will stick. A word of warning, though, just on the last two pillars we talked about, so retrieval practice and spaced learning. When you start to do spaced retrieval practice well, using that Goldilocks principle, spacing it long enough that it feels a bit hard to remember stuff, frankly, that will feel like harder work than just making notes or just rereading. And that is a good thing. Like if you were an athlete and you were doing workouts that barely made you break a sweat, you're probably not going to be waking up the next morning with a body that is fitter and stronger. It's the same with your memory. Like if you're just finishing your study sessions and, you're just kind of with that feeling of, I felt like I gave my memory a bit of a workout there. I did some hard remembering. Like that is good. That is what you want to be aiming for. And the beauty is you won't need to study for as long hours if you are doing that. So, as I like to say to my coaching clients, feel the burn when you learn. Just like an athlete, we are memory athletes as students. So, feel the burn when you learn. Work smarter, work with more intensity, and you won't need to work for as much study time. You get better results with less stress. Again, it's all about working smarter, not harder. Okay, I'm going to recap all 6 pillars for you in just a moment. But again, remember that this episode is just the beginning of this How to Study series. Do stay tuned for the remainder of the series over the weeks to come as I break down, the actual steps you want to follow for best results with a range of great study strategies. I'm going to be starting with the strategy of blank page retrieval in part 2 of this 8-part series, which is coming your way in a couple of weeks' time. In the meantime, I do hope you'll be able to join me next week for that inspirational story of success after adversity with recent university graduate Katie. That'll be a good episode. I hope you'll be able to tune in for that one. And do remember, as I mentioned, that I have summarised some of the most important ideas from this episode, including the forgetting curve and several other really, really important ideas in my exam success cheat sheet. You can pick up your copy absolutely free at examstudyexpert.com/free tips. It's examstudyexpert.com/free tips. So as promised, let me wrap up today by just recapping the 6 pillars one last time for you. So, number 1 was know where you're going. Have a clear outline of what it is you need to do before you start, whether that's the topics you need to learn for a test or exam, or a clear vision of, what good looks like, what a good project looks like, what a good assignment looks like. Pillar number 2, know you can get there. Remember, your brain can grow and change. You can improve and level up your abilities. This idea of growth mindset. So play the yet game. Say that you're not good at maths yet. And remember that this is literally true at the level of the wiring of your brain sometimes. So, your brain is not just growing and changing as a kind of nice metaphor. It can be literally true at the very level of your brain. So the right kind of practice, the right kind of deliberate practice. Pillar number 3 is making time for the journey. So making time for that practice, establishing a good study routine with enough time to work, but also enough time to sleep, eat, exercise, as well as relax and have fun once in a while. Remember, consistency is key. It's what you do every day that counts to build long-term results. Pillar number 4. Eyes on the road while driving. Practice monotasking. So not multitasking and being distracted, but monotasking and being very focused on just one thing at a time. And using the various techniques we talked about to control both external and internal distractions as best you can. Pillar number 5 is learning faster by retrieving, so pulling information out of memory by testing yourself. And number 6 was remember for longer by spacing. So spacing out that retrieval practice over time. Ideally, building spaced retrieval sessions right into your study routine so that you can just do it on autopilot. For example, starting or ending the day with a retest on everything you studied in the past 24 hours. And as I hope you're starting to see, the beauty of all of these 6 pillars is they work together as a complete and coherent system. Knowing where you're going, make sure you're spending time on the right things. Know that you can get there and making time for the journey. Make sure that you're both appropriately motivated and creating enough time each day and each week for the practice, the studying that you need to succeed. Learning faster by retrieving and remember for longer by spacing, those 2 final pillars on memory, those help you, learn faster and remember for longer, but they do take more cognitive effort. feel the burn when you learn, and they're more taxing practices for your brain compared to just rereading or kind of lower value study strategies. So you do need those strategies for 100% focus and concentration from pillar number 4, eyes on the road when driving. Otherwise, you might struggle to do pillar number 5 and 6. But the good news is that when you do all of this and you do start to learn faster and remember more, it gets easier to make time for the journey because you won't need to crazy long study hours to achieve great results. So that makes it easier to achieve, pillar 3. And because you're mastering your course material faster and more effectively, you'll start to see your results go up. Maybe just slowly at first, especially if you're kind of a bit new to all of this. But as you start to see those green shoots, you start to see those early signs of progress, it becomes a heck of a lot easier to know in your heart that you can get there, that you can grow and change and make tomorrow better than today. Pillar number 2. So look, I'm really excited for you as you begin your journey or advance your journey with these 6 pillars. Genuinely wish you every success, and I look forward to joining you for the next part of the series very soon. Wishing you every success in your studies. Thanks for listening.
If you've got exams coming up, you can now get all of William's favourite tips and tricks to save you time and get you higher grades, all in one handy cheat sheet. Grab your copy at examstudyexpert.com/free tips. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.